My name's Rachel Hammersley. I'm a senior lecturer at Newcastle University, and I'm going to talk today about the period in English history 1640 to 1660. I'm going to deal with the labelling of the period, the historiography of the period, and the descent into war. The period 1640 to 1660 in British history is unusual. On the one hand, it was a hugely eventful era. It witnessed a bloody civil war which pitted the king against his parliament and probably resulted in the loss of a larger proportion of the adult male population than World War I. It also saw the first official trial and execution of a king in history and the establishment of the first and only English Republic. Yet in spite, or perhaps because of the earth-shattering nature of these events, historians have rarely been able to agree on a single label that can be used to describe the period. Historians of the French and Russian revolutions may disagree on many things, but they all accept the term that is used to describe the events on which they focus. While 1640 to 1660 is sometimes referred to as an English Revolution, this label is by no means accepted by all historians of these events. And there are also several competing terms that are commonly used to describe the period. Given this lack of consensus, any serious discussion of British history of the mid-17th century must begin with some consideration of terminology. I will therefore begin this podcast by offering a brief account of the various labels that have been used to describe this period of British history and the issues that each of them raise. This will then feed into a brief summary of the main historiographical approaches that have been adopted in relation to this period. Finally, I will hone in on the knotty question of how England descended into civil war in the summer of 1642, and on what grounds MPs and members of the public chose to support one side or the other. How then have the events of 1640 to 1660 been labelled? Perhaps the best place to begin when thinking about labels is to consider what terms people at the time used to describe the events through which they were living. One of the first full accounts of the period to be written was that of Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. His History of the Rebellion was published posthumously in the years 1702 to 1704. Hyde had, however, lived through and participated in the events he was describing, and he had claimed to have begun the work during the 1640s. It is not difficult, on the basis of the title, to work out which side Hyde had been on. By describing the period as a rebellion, he was both implying that those who had perpetrated the events were rebels and were therefore in the wrong, and was also suggesting that the period marked only a temporary aberration from the normal course of events. The second label used at the time, Civil War, is perhaps the one that is most popular today and is in some ways the easiest both to understand and to justify. It indicates that the nation was divided and that at least two sides were engaged in armed conflict against each other. However, this label raises its own problems. Strictly speaking, it can only be used to refer to the period 1642 to 6, the period of the First Civil War, and 1648, the period of the Second Civil War. Hence Blair-Worden's decision to call his recent introduction to the period the English Civil Wars. While some historians have spoken in terms of a third civil war between 1649 and 1651, during which Oliver Cromwell suppressed trouble in Scotland and Ireland, this term cannot be used to refer to the period between 1652 and 1660. Hence, historians dealing with the entire period tend to resort to the uncontroversial but cumbersome descriptor, the Civil Wars and Interregnum, with the latter term referring to the period between 1649 and 1660, when England was ruled without a king. As I suggested a moment ago, some historians opt instead for the term the English Revolution. Of course, the term revolution was not used to describe this period at the time. though the understanding of it to denote alteration or change, as opposed to moving full circle, was in common usage from the 15th century. And by the early 17th century, a political sense of the term was also emerging. It was the later Glorious Revolution of 1688–9 to which the term revolution was first applied. However, the French began using that label to refer to the earlier period in English history, from the 1790s, and the labelling was popularised by the French politician and historian François Guizot in the 1820s. The practice eventually caught on in England too, and by the 1870s the historian Samuel Rawson Gardner was making use of the term Puritan Revolution in his highly influential account of the period. In the 20th century, the label the English Revolution was adopted by Marxist historians such as Christopher Hill, who were intent on emphasising the similarities between the English Revolution of 1640 to 1660 and its French and Russian counterparts. This has led some scholars in the late 20th and early 21st centuries to reject the label, so as to avoid association with Marxist usage. Most historians who use the term the English Revolution today do so, however, without any real thought of these political connotations. Furthermore, the term revolution has more recently been revived by historians, seeking to emphasise the enormous transformation that took place within society during this period. Many have seen the events of 1648–9, including Pride's Purge, the trial and execution of the king, and the establishment of the English Republic, as themselves constituting a revolution. But David Cressy has gone further in putting a strong case for even the period 1640 to 1642 constituting a revolution in constitutional, political, cultural and even social terms. Perhaps even more contentious than the use of the term revolution is the practice of prefacing it with the label English. In almost no respect was the revolution a purely English affair. Charles I was, of course, King of Scotland and Ireland as well as England and Wales. Between 1639 and 1642, he faced uprisings in all three of his kingdoms. Indeed, some historians treat the series of events in Ireland from 1641 onwards as a revolution in its own right. Moreover, events in both Scotland and Ireland were crucial in provoking events in England in the first place, and in determining the course that they subsequently took. And people from Scotland and Ireland were involved in and directly affected by what happened in England. Consequently, historians have attempted to find a less Anglo-centric label. The terms British Civil Wars and Wars of the Three Kingdoms have come to be frequently used in recent decades. Austin Woolrich called his 2002 detailed survey of the period Britain in Revolution, though he remained sceptical as to whether a revolution had actually taken place. And John Pocock even proposed the Wars of the East Atlantic Archipelago.